In the Middle Ages, wealth could come in many forms: land, gold, power, or influence. But how did people actually become rich back then? In this documentary, you'll explore 12 real and historically proven paths to prosperity. From noble birth to trade, war, and marriage, this is the true story of wealth in medieval times. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the world of fortune, faith, and ambition, long before modern money ever existed. If you enjoy calm historical stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. In the modern world, wealth is often measured in numbers: dollars, assets, real estate, stocks. But in the Middle Ages, wealth was a more layered concept, less abstract, more tangible. It lived in land, in livestock, in influence, and in people. To understand how someone could become rich in the medieval world, we must first understand what rich truly meant in that time. The early medieval period was a world in recovery. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of Europe's infrastructure had broken down. Roads were in disrepair, cities had shrunk or disappeared, trade had slowed, life became more localized. In this world, wealth wasn't stored in vaults, it was walked upon, harvested, and inherited. The foundation of wealth was land. Owning land meant more than owning soil. It meant power, food, labor, and security. A single stretch of farmland could feed a family or employ dozens of workers. For the nobility, it also meant the ability to collect taxes, raise armies, and grant portions of that land to others in exchange for loyalty. Land was the source of food, housing, taxation, and control. Without land, no amount of coin could guarantee survival or status. But not all wealth was agricultural. In growing towns, other forms of riches began to appear. A skilled blacksmith, for example, could earn more than a peasant with fields. A cloth merchant, a brewer, a stonemason, each had paths to prosperity, though they were often long and uncertain. In these circles, wealth was not just land, but labor and craft. Still, status mattered, and status, like land, was often inherited. In most of Europe, wealth stayed in the hands of the nobility and the church. It was passed from father to son, generation to generation. One might become rich through marriage or through the unexpected death of a relative. But social mobility was rare. Most people died in the same class into which they were born. Gold and silver were rare and prized. Coins were minted by kings and bishops, but they were not part of everyday life for most people. Trade was often done by barter: a barrel of wheat for a goat, a blanket for a basket of apples. Only the wealthy used coinage regularly. And even then, its value depended on trust, weight, and purity. In cities, especially by the 12th and 13th centuries, merchants began to redefine wealth. No longer tied strictly to land, they earned through trade. Silk from the East, spices from Africa, amber from the Baltic, wool from England. These goods passed through many hands, increasing in value with each transaction. A clever merchant with the right connections and good timing could grow his fortune dramatically. But again, this required risk, travel, and capital, not easy things to come by. The church, too, held enormous wealth. Monasteries controlled large tracts of land, collected tithes from the faithful, and received donations from nobles hoping to secure their salvation. Some abbeys became centers of production, brewing beer, raising sheep, copying books. In return, they gathered resources and influence. A wealthy monastery might rival a lord in both power and assets. Yet wealth in the Middle Ages was always precarious. A bad harvest, a sudden war, a shift in alliances, or the outbreak of plague could change everything. A landowner might see his fields burned, a merchant's ship might sink at sea, a noble family could lose favor at court. Reversals of fortune were common and often permanent. Importantly, medieval people did not view wealth the way modern capitalists do. Profit was not necessarily the goal. Stability was. Security, continuity. A farmer did not aim to become rich, he aimed to feed his family. A noble did not always seek expansion, he often sought to preserve what was already his. Greed was viewed with suspicion, even sin. The church warned against usury or charging interest on loans. Ambition was a double-edged sword. Still, the dream of wealth existed. It took many forms, some spiritual, some material. For peasants, wealth meant a larger plot of land. For merchants, it meant larger inventories and foreign goods. For nobles, it meant more vassals and more horses. For the church, it meant influence and obedience. Each class had its own vision of richness, shaped by its role in society. And behind it all was structure. The medieval world was deeply hierarchical. Kings at the top, followed by lords, knights, clergy, merchants, artisans, and peasants. Moving upward was difficult, but not impossible. Through service, cunning, marriage, or war, some did rise. They became symbols of aspiration, and sometimes targets of envy. In summary, medieval wealth was both simpler and more complex than we might imagine. It was measured in fields, flocks, favors, and faith. It was held tightly, passed carefully, and lost easily. It reflected one's place in the social fabric and in the divine order. To understand how someone could become rich, we must always return to this basic truth, that in the Middle Ages, wealth was not just what you had, but who you were, where you stood, and what others owed you. And with that foundation laid, we can begin to explore the many paths that led a person, slowly, cautiously, and sometimes unexpectedly, toward medieval riches. In medieval Europe, wealth was often determined at birth. To be born into the nobility was to inherit not just land, but status, power, and access to the foundations of medieval society. While peasants toiled in the fields and merchants built fortunes over time, nobles began life already rich in rights, resources, and connections. Nobility in the Middle Ages wasn't just a title, it was a legal and social identity. A noble family held land granted by a king or another high lord, often in exchange for military service or loyalty. These estates were known as fiefs, and they could span villages, forests, rivers, and even towns. The noble was not just a landowner, he was a local authority, a military leader, and often the judge in his own domain. This privileged position was usually passed down through primogeniture, a system in which the eldest son inherited the entire estate. This preserved the power and size of noble holdings across generations, while younger siblings were often steered toward the church, the military, or strategic marriages. Daughters might be married off to cement alliances or given to convents, their dowries serving as tools of negotiation. The daily life of a noble reflected his place in the hierarchy. He lived in a manor house or castle, attended by servants and stewards. Meals were held in grand halls, often with music, hunting trophies, and the sound of clinking goblets. Education was tailored to leadership. Boys were taught strategy, Latin, and riding, while girls learned household management and courtly etiquette. Political influence was another form of noble wealth. A powerful lord could offer military support to a king, raise taxes on his land, or serve as an advisor. Some even held seats in royal courts or parliaments. Their opinions shaped laws, and their loyalties could tip the balance in times of war. Nobles were not just rich, they were essential to the machinery of medieval power. Marriage was one of the most powerful tools available to the nobility. A well-planned union could bring new land, reinforce peace, or join two houses into a single, more powerful family. These were not love matches, they were contracts. and they were enforced by custom, law, and tradition. But noble life wasn't without its challenges. Feuds between families could erupt into bloody conflicts. A failed heir could lead to the loss of land or title. And during times of war or plague, even noble estates could fall into ruin. Some families rose and fell within a single generation, while others endured for centuries. Despite these risks, nobility remained one of the surest paths to wealth in the medieval world. Born into privilege, educated in power, and surrounded by networks of influence, nobles occupied a class of their own. They didn't need to climb the ladder, they began at the top. In medieval Europe, land was the foundation of wealth. More than gold, more than trade, land determined who had power and who didn't. Those who controlled land controlled food, labor, law, and survival itself. At the top of this system stood the king, who technically owned all the land in his realm. But he didn't farm it or manage it directly. Instead, he granted large portions to his most trusted nobles, dukes, counts, and barons. These nobles became vassals, bound to the king through loyalty and obligation. This structure formed the heart of what we call feudalism. The land granted by a king was called a fief. In return for receiving it, a noble was expected to provide military support, collect taxes, and maintain order. But most nobles didn't manage their land alone. They divided it further, granting smaller parcels to knights and lesser lords, creating a pyramid of loyalty built entirely on land. At the very bottom of this system were the peasants, mostly serfs, who worked the land. A serf was not a slave, but he wasn't free either. He couldn't leave the estate without permission. In return for a place to live and a small plot to farm, he owed the lord labor, goods, and loyalty. His life was hard, but it was also stable. In a dangerous world, even limited protection was valuable. The manor became the center of rural life. A typical manor included the lord's house, farmland, meadows, woods, a mill, and sometimes even a church or small village. These manors were often self-sufficient, producing their own grain, livestock, and tools. The lord collected rent, oversaw disputes, and ensured that the manor remained productive. Owning land also meant controlling its resources. A river could power a mill, a forest could provide timber or hunting grounds, a village could generate taxes. Some lords even charged peasants for using shared tools or ovens. Every feature of the land could be monetized, and the cleverest lords knew how to turn nature into income. Land ownership also brought political clout. A wealthy landowner could influence local courts, negotiate marriages, or raise an army in times of war. Many noble families expanded their holdings through conquest, marriage, or favor with the crown. To own more land was to hold more power, not just economically, but socially and politically. And land was also a legacy. It was passed down from father to son, generation after generation. Laws of inheritance ensured that estates stayed intact, often favoring the eldest son. This practice preserved the wealth and influence of noble families for centuries. Even the church became one of the largest landholders in Europe, acquiring land through donations and bequests. Monasteries managed huge estates with the discipline of a business, using the profits to fund religious life and charitable works. In the medieval mind, land was life. To control it meant to endure, to influence, to feed, to command. And in a world where so much was uncertain, land was the closest thing to security there was. As Europe emerged from the early Middle Ages, something began to change along its roads and rivers. Towns, once rare, began to grow. Markets filled with goods and voices. And in these new centers of activity, a new path to wealth was forming, the path of the merchant. Unlike nobles, merchants were not born into privilege. They built their fortunes through trade, by understanding supply and demand, and by taking risks. At the heart of this growing economy were the marketplaces, bustling spaces where farmers, craftsmen, and traders came together. These markets were often held weekly, and over time became permanent parts of medieval towns. Merchants sold everything from bread and cloth to spices and iron tools. Some specialized in a single trade, while others dealt in many goods. To succeed, a merchant needed more than product. He needed knowledge: where goods were in demand, how much to charge, and when to buy and sell. As trade expanded, merchants organized themselves into guilds, associations that regulated prices, protected members, and negotiated with town rulers. A merchant guild might also fund defenses, festivals, and even local law enforcement. In many places, guild members formed the backbone of the town's political structure. The rise of towns gave merchants new opportunities. Towns offered legal protections, a central place for trade, and freedom from feudal obligations. Some towns even received charters from kings or nobles, granting them the right to govern themselves. In these places, merchants could gain not only wealth, but status. While some merchants focused on local trade, others reached beyond their region. They traveled dangerous roads or funded expeditions, importing goods from distant lands. These long-distance traders brought in salt, silk, spices, and fine cloth, luxuries that nobles and the church eagerly bought. A successful trade journey could transform a modest shopkeeper into a rich man. Urban merchants also invested in property. Owning a shop near a busy square could generate steady income. Some merchants built homes above their storefronts or bought entire buildings to rent. Over time, these families became part of the urban elite, respected, influential, and wealthy. Still, the merchant's life was uncertain. A shipment might be stolen or delayed. A market might collapse. Illness, war, or political change could end a business overnight. Unlike landowners, merchants had little protection from disaster. Yet the merchant's wealth was flexible. He could reinvest, adapt, and grow. He didn't rely on harvests or royal favor, only his judgment. Over time, some merchant families rivaled minor nobles in wealth and power. Their children married into respectable families. Their names appeared on city records, church windows, and stone buildings. In the medieval world, the rise of the merchant signaled a shift. It showed that wealth could be earned, not just inherited. That status could be built, not only bestowed. And that towns, once small and overlooked, could become centers of prosperity and influence. In a time when most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of home, a few ventured far beyond, chasing profit across mountains, deserts, and seas. These were the long-distance traders of the medieval world, and for them, wealth wasn't grown or inherited, it was carried. By the 12th and 13th centuries, trade routes connected Europe to Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. Along the Silk Road, caravans brought silk, spices, dyes, and gems from far-off lands. Through Mediterranean ports like Venice and Genoa, these goods flowed into Europe, expensive, rare, and in high demand. Spices were among the most valuable. Black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just for flavor. They preserved food, masked spoilage, and held symbolic value. Fine textiles and dyes brought color and prestige. Ivory, glassware, and precious metals became signs of status in noble courts and churches. Traders rarely traveled the full route themselves. Goods passed through many hands, from Chinese merchants to Arab middlemen, from Byzantine traders to European buyers. With each step, the price rose, and so did the potential for profit. Trade fairs played a crucial role in this system. In places like Champagne, France, merchants from across Europe gathered to buy, sell, and negotiate. These fairs were not just commercial, They were cultural crossroads, where languages mixed and news traveled faster than any messenger. But long-distance trade carried risks. Caravans could be attacked, ships could sink, local rulers could seize cargo or impose taxes. To survive, merchants needed contracts, partners, and sometimes guards. Still, the rewards were high, and for those who mastered the system, fortunes could be made. Families like the Medici and the Fuggers built empires from finance and trade. They didn't just sell goods, they funded shipments, managed accounts, and controlled supply chains. Their influence extended into politics, religion, and art. And it all began with the movement of goods across borders. In a world built on farming and feudal ties, long-distance trade offered something new. The idea that wealth could come not from land, but from movement, from exchange, and from knowing what others needed before they even asked for it. In medieval towns, wealth didn't always come from land or inheritance. For many, it was shaped by hands, skill, and discipline. These were the craftsmen, men and women who worked in leather, stone, wood, and cloth, and who, over time, carved out a path to prosperity. A craftsman's journey began with apprenticeship. Often at the age of 12 or 13, a boy would leave his home to live and learn under a master. For years, he would perform basic tasks, observe skilled work, and slowly practice the techniques of the trade. Once trained, the apprentice became a journeyman, able to earn wages, travel to new towns, and gain experience. To become a master, however, he had to present a masterpiece, a single, flawless work judged by his peers. Only then could he open a shop, take on apprentices, and join the local guild. Guilds were more than trade groups. They were networks of protection, quality control, and influence. They set prices, enforced standards, and trained new generations. In some cities, guilds even held political power, sending representatives to councils and helping shape laws. Some trades offered more profit than others. Goldsmiths, masons, and cloth weavers were often the most successful, especially when their work served the nobility or the church. A skilled artisan might receive commissions for cathedral carvings, ceremonial armor, or fine tapestries. But even everyday trades could bring stability. A cobbler with a loyal clientele or a brewer with good ale could support a family, purchase property, and become respected in town. Over decades, successful craftsmen passed down tools, workshops, and trade secrets to their children. Women also participated, especially in textile work, brewing, and shopkeeping. While they were often excluded from formal guild leadership, many worked beside their husbands or inherited businesses after their deaths. Craftsmanship was not fast wealth. It was built over years of practice, reputation, and steady labor. But for those without noble blood or merchant capital, the workshop door was one of the few paths open, and for many it was enough. In a world built on land and loyalty, a quiet new power was growing, based not on swords or soil, but on numbers, contracts, and credit. This was the world of medieval banking, and for those who understood it, it offered a new path to wealth and influence. Banking in the Middle Ages began with money changers, men who converted coins between regions and ensured fair transactions in busy marketplaces. As trade expanded, their services became more complex. They began offering loans, holding deposits, and issuing bills of exchange, allowing merchants to transfer money without carrying heavy coins. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Bruges, powerful banking families emerged. The Medici are perhaps the most famous, starting as merchants, then becoming financiers to popes, kings, and cities. Their banking empire stretched across Europe, with branches in major trade hubs. But banking wasn't without controversy. The church condemned usury, the charging of interest. To navigate this, bankers used creative legal tools, structuring loans as investments, charging fees instead of interest, or working through intermediaries. While technically compliant, these practices tested moral boundaries. Medieval banking also introduced the idea of risk management. Loans were carefully calculated. Debts were tracked in ledgers with precision. Wealth was no longer just physical. It became abstract, stored in agreements, reputation, and paper. These early bankers wielded quiet power. They funded wars, rescued monarchies from debt, and financed cathedrals. Their influence was rarely visible to the common person, but in royal courts and merchant halls, their voices carried weight. For many, banking was a way to rise without land or title. It required intelligence, discipline, and trust. And though it came with risk, default, fraud, or sudden collapse, it also offered something rare, a form of wealth not bound by soil, but by strategy. In the Middle Ages, the church was more than a place of worship. It was one of the most powerful and wealthiest institutions in all of Europe. From the humblest village chapels to the grandest cathedrals, the church held land, influence, and immense economic strength. Much of the church's wealth came through land ownership. By the 12th century, monasteries and bishoprics controlled vast estates, gifted by kings, nobles, and common people alike. These donations were often made in exchange for spiritual rewards, prayers, forgiveness, or burial rites. Over time, the church became the largest landholder in many regions. Another major source of income was the tithe, a religious tax requiring people to give 1/10 of their produce or income. Collected from nearly everyone, this system funneled grain, livestock, and money into church hands, which it then redistributed or accumulated. Monasteries acted like economic hubs. They operated farms, ran mills, brewed ale, and copied manuscripts. Their lands were often well managed and productive. Some even lent grain or money in times of famine, reinforcing their role as both spiritual and material providers. Cathedrals were not only places of worship, but also symbols of wealth. Their construction spanned decades, funded by donations, indulgences, and church treasuries. Towns that hosted great cathedrals often thrived through pilgrimage, drawing visitors who spent on lodging, food, and offerings. Religious institutions also shaped how wealth was understood. The church preached moderation and charity, yet its higher ranks often lived in luxury. Bishops resided in palaces, and popes managed international diplomacy with the resources of kings. For some, joining the church was a path to power. A second son of a noble family might become an abbot or bishop, managing lands and commanding respect. Even commoners, if educated and devoted, could rise through the clerical ranks. In a world where salvation was central, the church offered not only hope for the afterlife, but a strong hand in this one. Its wealth, though cloaked in ritual and faith, was very real, and it shaped medieval society from the ground up. In the Middle Ages, war was not only a matter of honor or defense, it was also a source of wealth. For many nobles, knights, and even common soldiers, military success could lead to land, gold, and influence. When armies conquered towns or castles, they often claimed plunder, everything from livestock and weapons to coins, cloth, and tools. Looting was a standard part of warfare. For soldiers, it was often their main form of payment. For commanders, it was a way to reward loyalty and fund future campaigns. Another lucrative aspect of war was ransom. Capturing a noble enemy alive could be far more profitable than killing him. The families of lords, knights, and royalty were often willing to pay large sums to ensure their safe return. A single prisoner could enrich a soldier for years. War also reshaped the ownership of land. Kings rewarded loyal vassals with newly conquered territories. In Spain, during the Reconquista, Christian knights were granted land taken from Muslim rulers. In the Crusader states, Entire kingdoms changed hands. For those who served the right side at the right time, war could transform their fortunes. Some became professional soldiers or mercenaries, fighting not for kings or causes, but for payment. These men, highly skilled, well-armed, and often ruthless, could make a living in a violent and shifting landscape. Their leaders sometimes became powerful figures in their own right. Even those who didn't fight directly profited from war. Armorers, blacksmiths, and suppliers made money producing weapons, tents, and provisions. Wealth flowed not just through bloodshed, but through logistics. But military wealth was fragile. Victory one year could be followed by defeat the next. A captured castle could fall again. Loot could be lost in transit. And for every knight who gained riches, many more lost everything, or their lives. Still, in a world ruled by force, the sword opened doors. War was a gamble, but for those who survived and succeeded, it was a direct and often rapid route to wealth. As medieval towns grew, they became more than marketplaces. They became engines of economic and social change. For many people, the city offered something rare in the Middle Ages, a chance to grow rich through skill, strategy, and opportunity, rather than birth. The most visible path to wealth in the city was real estate. As more people moved into towns, land within city walls became valuable. Some families bought homes near busy markets and rented space to merchants. Others built multi-story houses, living above and working below. Trade and urban manufacturing also fueled prosperity. Workshops produced textiles, leather goods, tools, and glass. A skilled artisan or entrepreneur could build a business, employ workers, and sell goods both locally and abroad. Textile production in cities like Ghent and Florence became major industries, creating powerful merchant families. Cities also provided access to professional roles. Notaries, scribes, lawyers, and physicians served the growing needs of urban populations. Those with literacy and training could earn steady incomes and build reputations. In a world where education was rare, knowledge was valuable. Guilds played a key role in this rise. They regulated trades, set prices, trained apprentices, and protected their members. In some cities, wealthy guild leaders became part of the local government. Urban elites, known as burghers or patricians, gained power and influence that rivaled the old nobility. Urban life also allowed for social mobility. A successful merchant could marry into a noble family. A wealthy widow might continue her husband's business and grow it further. In towns, money and reputation could sometimes matter more than ancestry. Still, city life carried risk. Fire, disease, and economic collapse were never far away. But for many, the rewards outweighed the dangers. The medieval city offered something that feudal life often didn't: the possibility of rising through one's own efforts. In these towns of stone and timber, beneath bell towers and behind market stalls, a new kind of wealth was forming, built not on inheritance but on initiative. In the medieval world, marriage was more than a personal union. It was a powerful tool of wealth and strategy. For noble families, merchant dynasties, and even common households, marriage determined not just social ties, but the future of land, money, and influence. Among the nobility, marriage served as an alliance. A daughter's hand could bring peace between rival families. A son's marriage could gain new territory or solidify a claim to a title. These unions were planned carefully, often from childhood, and arranged with legal contracts, witnesses, and dowry negotiations. The dowry was a key element in these agreements. It was the wealth a bride brought to her new household: land, coin, livestock, or goods. A large dowry increased the value of a marriage match and gave the bride's family leverage. In return, the groom's family often promised a dower, a form of financial security should the husband die. This wasn't limited to nobles. wealthy merchants used marriage to build business alliances. A silk trader might marry his daughter to the son of a banker. Guild masters married within their trade to keep knowledge and reputation intact. For urban families, marriage was a path to stability, expansion, and respectability. Marriage also allowed younger sons and daughters to find opportunity in a world where inheritance typically favored the eldest. A well-married daughter could elevate her entire family. A second son might gain land or access to a new region through his wife. In some cases, marriage was even used to escape hardship. A widow might remarry to protect her assets. A struggling noble might marry into merchant wealth. While love sometimes played a role, economics nearly always did. But marriage also carried risks. If a dowry went unpaid or a spouse died young, families could fall into legal or financial dispute. Some unions led to tension, power imbalance, or scandal. In rare cases, alliances made through marriage pulled entire regions into conflict. Still, in a world shaped by birth and inheritance, marriage gave people a way to redirect fortune. Through careful matches, wealth could be preserved, grown, or entirely transformed. In the medieval world, wealth was never truly secure. Whether earned through land, trade, war, or marriage, fortune could vanish as quickly as it came. Fire, famine, plague, betrayal, any of these could undo a lifetime of careful planning. Fires swept through wooden towns with terrifying speed. In a single night, a merchant might lose his home, his shop, and his savings. War could destroy fields and villages, or see a noble house fall from power. Plagues like the Black Death did not care about wealth. They emptied manors and city streets alike, erasing generations of work. Even without disaster, debt could ruin families. A missed payment, a lost shipment, or a failed harvest could leave nobles or merchants scrambling to repay creditors. In many cases, debts passed on to children, dragging entire lineages into poverty. Reputation mattered too. A scandal or broken agreement could cost someone their guild membership, political favor, or marriage prospects. Wealth in the Middle Ages was closely tied to trust. Once that was gone, rebuilding was difficult. And yet, many did rebuild. A landless knight might become a mercenary. A ruined merchant might partner with a former rival. Widows often took over their husbands' businesses and ran them successfully. Monks and nuns, too, sometimes came from failed families, finding safety and structure behind monastery walls. Migration was another path forward. People moved to towns or new regions seeking a fresh start. New trade routes, new guilds, or new patrons meant new chances. The city, in particular, offered opportunities to begin again, if one had the courage and skills. In the end, the story of wealth in the Middle Ages was not just about how it was made, but how it was lost and how it could be regained. Success required more than status. It demanded resilience, relationships, and the ability to adapt. Because in a world shaped by uncertainty, the true wealth of the Middle Ages may have been the strength to start over.